let's start by benchmarking. And if we don't have targets, we want to use that wonderful habit number 2 from Stephen Covey, in his book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Habit number 2 is effective people begin with the end in mind. So let's begin with the end in mind with some benchmarking. First of all, is an overall benchmark. For a general dental practice, where should your overhead be? Where should your overhead be? Again, I'm talking about general dental practice. The numbers will be different for a specialty practice, but for a general dental practice, what we shoot for with our clients is overhead no higher than 60%, no higher than 60%. And that would include all of the necessary expenses to run your practice, with the exception of owner-dentist compensation. Owner-dentist compensation. So that's the only thing that isn't included, in that 60% overhead. So we want to get your overhead to 60% or less. Now, it's becoming more and more difficult to do that, especially with rising costs. And that's what this episode is about how, at the time we're recording this, when we're under increased inflationary pressures, how do we lower your overhead to get that 60% or less overhead? Now, I can confidently tell you that everybody listening to this can get their overhead to 60% or less. Now, why can I say that so confidently? Because we have done this with my coaching with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of clients, where they'll start much higher than 60% overhead. And we get that overhead down to 60% or less. So I can say it confidently because if it's been done before, it must be possible. Now, I will add that in an inflationary cycle like we have now, there's nothing going to be easy about this. It's going to be difficult, but it is possible. And without that, I think we have to start with that positive approach, positive mindset. Because if you believe it's impossible, you're already half defeated before we ever start.
Gary, can I brag on you for a bit? I still remember the very first client that I got to experience since I started working together several years ago. I believe he was doing 1.5 million at the time, PPO infested practice. And he started with you, and before he knew it, within 12 months, his profit went up by $300,000. He was just blown away. He has been practicing a certain way for 20 years. You just told him, or you just helped him find $300,000 in terms of profits just by making some changes. And he was working less.
His practice was plateaued, not only in, collections, right, but also in his net income. In fact, actually been going down a little bit every year because of increased cost, wage increases, and so on. But it had been going down. And in our first year of working together, not only did his top number go up because of increased production and collection, but his bottom line increased by $300,000 a year in direct bottom line profitability, direct to doctor. And we'll talk more about that as we go. But let me continue with benchmarking. So while any dentist listening to this, if you look at your profit and loss statement, you're going to have anywhere from 40 to 50 line items of expenses. When you look at your profit and loss statement, there'll be 40 to 50, depending on the size of your practice. And I really only care about 5 of those line items, because 5 of those line items of expenses, Naren, equal 85% of all the expenses in a dental practice. So let's say you've got a profit and loss statement that has 50 line items of expenses, and 5 of those represent 85% of your expenses. The other 45 line items only make up 15% of your expenses. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to those, because you want to be a good steward of your expenses, but let's focus on the low fruit on the tree, the low-hanging fruit, which are those 5 areas of expense. So let's benchmark those 5 areas. The highest expense in any practice are team member compensation. And it's an all-in expense. Not only does it include their wages, but it would include their bonus. It would include all the related costs like FICA, FUTA, unemployment insurance, payroll taxes, payroll service. If you're doing matching 401k contributions, if you provide health insurance benefits, any expense related to hiring someone in your practice goes in that category. And the benchmark for that is 28 to 30% of your revenue, 28 to 30%. Now, I need to explain why that is a sliding scale, Naren. As all of us know by listening to or by simply experiencing what's happening today with the inflationary cycle, wages are up radically in any dental practice. Wages are escalating rapidly. So recently, I had a chance to talk to a number of accounting firms that specialize in working with dentists. And I asked them if the 28%, which we've historically used, was still relevant at the time of recording this podcast when our wages are up so high. Is that 28% target still relevant? And here's what we came up with. That if you're on either coast of the United States, so if you're on the West Coast or the East Coast, or major inland cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Denver, then the 28% is not realistic anymore because of the rapidly increasing wages. The target has to be 30% in those areas. So if you're on either coast, West Coast, East Coast, or major inland cities, I'd add Atlanta to that group, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Denver. If you're in those cities, then the 28% is no longer realistic because the wage pressure is even higher. Your target is 30%, all in 30%. If you're in anywhere else in the country, then you can still hold to that 28% benchmark. So there gives you some modern, completely up to the moment benchmarking for your wages. Number two is lab. And again, I'm going to use a sliding scale of 4 to 8%. And the sliding scale will depend on whether you're doing CAD/CAM dentistry or not, whether you're a CEREC office or not. If you're a CEREC office, then I use a budget of 4% for your outside lab because much of the lab single unit type stuff you're going to be doing with your CEREC. If all of your work goes outside to a lab, then I use a budget of 8%. And by the way, anytime I use a percent number, the percent is a percent of revenue, percent of your collections. So for example, if you had $1 million practice in collections, Naren, and you're a CEREC office, you've got a 4%, $40,000 annual budget for lab. If everything goes out to a lab, then you've got a budget of $80,000 a year for lab. Does that make sense, Naren?
Yes.
Yep. Number three is your facility cost, rent or mortgage. But this is also an all-in expense beyond just rent or mortgage. That would include repairs. If you're leasing space, common area maintenance. If you own space, that would include property taxes, all of it, and anything related to your facility. And my budget is 5% or less for facility. The fourth area is consumable supplies, and consumable supplies is 6% or less, 6% or less. And then finally, marketing. And I'm going to give you a new benchmark for marketing on this because this has been what we are consistently experiencing with my clients. The budget for marketing is 1 to 2% of your revenue, 1 to 2% of your revenue. Well, there's benchmarking. So now we've established with a top line, a goal of overhead no higher than 60%. And now we've broken it down into the 5 categories: team member wages at 28 to 30%, lab at 4 to 8%, facility at 5% or less, consumable supplies 6% or less, or marketing at 1 to 2%. Now let's talk about what, as you analyze that and you look at your profit and loss statement, how do you lower your overhead? And I'm going to talk about, where the boat could be leaking. Imagine that you're in a boat and there's water coming in. There's water coming into the boat. Where's the boat leaking? Where your profitability may be leaking in your practice. For example, if you have a facility cost that is, say, 7% annual, then that's 2% above my benchmark of 5% or less. That may mean that you're not producing enough in order to afford the space that you're in. And the same thing if your wages expenses are high. Your wage expense would mean you're not producing enough to support the team that you have. And while we can all find savings by scrubbing your profit and loss statement, the scrubbing is a useful exercise. And it's something I think every one of our listeners should do. You should quite literally, if you haven't done it in a while, take a look at all of the expenses that go in every one of your, especially those 5 items of expenses, everything that goes in there, and see what you can do to lower that. And oftentimes we find when I do that exercise with my clients, we often find opportunities to save money, which represents, part of the ways we're going to reduce our overhead. But while I would encourage you to look at that, let me also tell you that there's bigger fish to fry. In other words, there's better approaches to increase your overhead, or increase your profitability, lower your overhead. There's better strategies to lower your overhead. And one of the important things to do is consider a growth strategy. If you can grow your practice with the same team and the same hours, if we can grow your practice, and let me use a round number that makes it easy to do my math, Naren, if we can grow the practice, same team, same hours, the profitability is quite impressive on the growth dollars. Let me walk you through that exercise. And I'm going to use $100,000 because it makes the math easy. Plus, I believe every one of our listeners could grow your practice by $100,000 in collections. And I'm specifically talking about collections here because it's got to be real and collectible.